Chinese spies caught on camera, a multi-billion-pound scandal that could drain the banks, and a government too afraid to call Beijing what it really is. Welcome to Britain, where the headlines never disappoint and the truth is always stranger than fiction. I'm Andrew Meet Rich, and today we're diving deep into what the British press is screaming about this Wednesday, October 8th. Let's cut through the noise and see what's really going on. Before we go further, let me tell you something. I spent years inside one of the biggest media outlets you've ever heard of. I watched editors twist facts, bury inconvenient truths, and shape narratives to please the people signing the checks. I couldn't do it anymore. So I left. Now I work for myself. I answer to no one, and I tell you what the mainstream won't. That's the difference. That's why you're here. And if you value that kind of honesty, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and if you really want to support independent journalism that doesn't bow to corporate interests, consider becoming a sponsor. Your support keeps this operation running and keeps me free to speak the truth without filters. Now, let's get into it. The Daily Mail is leading with something that should alarm every single person paying attention. Chinese espionage in Great Britain, carte blanche. That's how they're putting it. And they're not alone. Several major British newspapers are running the same explosive story, all focused on a statement from Stephen Parkinson, the director of the Crown Prosecution Service. Here's what he said. The case against two men suspected of spying for Beijing collapsed because the government refused to designate China as an active threat. Think about that for a second. They had suspects. They had evidence. But the case fell apart not because the men were innocent, but because the British government wouldn't officially label China as dangerous. If you've been following my coverage, you might remember these two alleged spies. They somehow got into a parliamentary session and were filming everything on their iPads. Not exactly James Bond material, right? But here's the thing, whether they were sophisticated or sloppy doesn't matter. What matters is that the system let them walk. The Daily Telegraph digs deeper into why this prosecution crumbled. Both men deny the charges, of course, but the government refused to hand over evidence that could have secured convictions under the Official Secrets Act. These suspects were allegedly gathering intelligence on members of parliament who are critical of China, then passing that information straight to officials in Beijing. When confronted about this disaster, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer basically shrugged and said, "It's not my party's fault." He claims the requests for information date back to before Labour took power. That's convenient, isn't it? Pass the blame backward. Don't take responsibility. Just point fingers at whoever was in charge before. This is classic political maneuvering, and it's exactly the kind of thing that makes people lose faith in their leaders. But stay with me, because this gets worse. The Times also leads with the Chinese espionage case collapse, and their reporting highlights something even more troubling. Prosecutors made repeated requests for evidence from the government. Those requests went unanswered. Starmer's explanation? He couldn't provide such evidence because China wasn't officially designated as a security threat back in 2022 and 2023, during the period when these alleged crimes took place. A cabinet source told the paper, "We couldn't provide evidence that contradicts the government's position at that time." Let me break this down in plain English. The British government is saying they can't prosecute Chinese spies because admitting China is a threat would contradict their previous political stance. They're choosing diplomatic comfort over national security. They're more worried about offending Beijing than protecting their own parliament. And this, my friends, is what happens when governments prioritize relationships with authoritarian regimes over the safety of their own citizens. But don't go anywhere, because Britain's problems don't end with foreign espionage. There's a firestorm brewing over comments made by a Conservative Party figure, and it's tearing communities apart. The Guardian is covering the spy scandal too, but they're putting something else front and centre. Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Minister, is under fire for what critics are calling toxic nationalism. Jenrick recently made statements about Birmingham's Handsworth area, calling it one of the worst integrated places he's ever seen. He's standing by those words even as local leaders and activists accuse him of fanning flames and dividing communities. Now, if you caught my coverage yesterday, you already know about this controversy. Jenrick didn't just criticize the area, he said he didn't see a single white face there. That's a direct quote, and it sparked outrage. But here's where it gets interesting. The Metro newspaper takes this story and runs with it in a way that's both bold and controversial. Metro's headline today reads, "No white, not wrong, Bob." It's a play on the English phrase, "don't make it wrong," but they've replaced wrong with white. That's a provocative editorial choice, and it signals just how heated this debate has become. Community leaders in Handsworth are calling Jenrick's comments divisive. They're saying his words are designed to stoke fear and resentment, not to solve real problems. And you know what? They might have a point. When politicians start focusing on the color of people's faces rather than the issues affecting communities, poverty, lack of opportunity, failing infrastructure, that's when, the conversation has gone off the rails. But Jenrick isn't backing down. He's doubling down, insisting that his concerns about integration are legitimate. So where does that leave us? With a country more divided than ever and politicians on both sides using inflammatory language to score points. Classic stuff. If you're still with me, hit that like button, drop a comment below and let me know what you think about this integration debate. Is Jenrick raising valid concerns or is he just stirring the pot? I want to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe because we're just getting started. Let's shift gears now because there's another massive story dominating British headlines today, and this one involves billions of pounds. The Daily Express is reporting that Conservative Party leader Kemi Badenoch spoke at the party conference today, slamming Labour's economic policies. She called them theft from our children and grandchildren. Strong words. Badenoch claims her party is the only one with a real plan to get Britain's economy back on track. Now, I always find it fascinating how newspapers report on speeches before they happen. How do they know exactly what she's going to say? Advanced copies of prepared remarks, obviously. But it makes you wonder how much of politics is scripted theatre. Either way, Badenoch is positioning herself as the economic saviour and Labour as the villain robbing future generations. Whether you buy that narrative depends entirely on where you sit politically. But here's a story that transcends party lines. The newspaper reports that millions of drivers are about to receive payouts of up to £700 each as part of a massive £8.2 billion compensation package. This stems from a huge auto loan scandal. Financial companies broke the rules by failing to properly inform buyers about the commissions they were pocketing on roughly 14 million car deals. Think about that number. 14 million transactions where people were kept in the dark about how much extra they were paying so that finance companies could line their pockets. The Financial Times is also covering this scandal, estimating the total cost to banks could reach £11 billion. Even though that figure is lower than the industry feared, this is still on track to become one of the largest compensation schemes in the sector's history. These payouts cover loans that were improperly sold over a 17-year period. 17 years of deception, millions of people affected, and only now are the banks being forced to make it right. The Sun puts it even more bluntly with a headline that's pure tabloid gold. Karching. It's a play on the sound of a cash register, combined with the word car. One person set to receive compensation called the news long overdue. And you know what? They're absolutely right. For nearly 2 decades, ordinary people were ripped off by companies that were supposed to be trustworthy. The fact that it took this long for justice to arrive is a damning indictment of the regulatory system. But at least it's happening. At least someone is being held accountable. That's more than we can say for a lot of scandals. Now let's talk about something darker. The Daily Mirror is covering a parole hearing that's reopening old wounds for a family that suffered unimaginable pain. David Norris, the man convicted in connection with the tragic loss of life of Stephen Lawrence, made statements at his parole hearing that have shocked many. He admitted to striking the teenager while he was on his knees. But here's what's really infuriating. Norris refused to name the others involved in the violent acts committed by the group that night. The Mirror writes that his silence is prolonging the agony for the victims' parents who have spent decades fighting for justice. This case is one of the most infamous in British history, a brutal act that exposed deep problems with how authorities handle such incidents and how justice is applied or not applied based on who the victims are. The Lawrence family's fight changed British law enforcement and sparked a national conversation about equality and accountability. But even now, decades later, they're still not getting the full truth. Norris won't give up the names. He won't provide the closure this family deserves. And that's the real tragedy here. Justice delayed and incomplete. And finally, because British media never misses a chance to lighten the mood after heavy news, let's talk about the Daily Star. They're running a story that's pure entertainment. Meet James McAlpine, a 22-year-old Conservative Party supporter who stands 7 feet 2 inches tall. That's about 218 centimeters for those using the metric system. The headline? never-ending Tory. It's a play on words, referring both to his height and the seemingly endless nature of Conservative Party drama. Kemi Badenoch is reportedly thrilled about her towering new recruit, who's focused on fighting what they're calling Labour's Farmageddon. That's their term for criticism of Labour's agricultural policies. The Star writes, this is a tall order, making sure to squeeze in a pun about the guy's height. Leave it to the Daily Star to find the absurd angle in every story. When politics gets too serious, they'll always find a way to make you smile. Before we wrap this up, let me remind you what we've covered today, because there's a lot to process. First, the Chinese spy case that collapsed because the British government refused to call China a threat, prioritizing diplomatic relations over national security. Then Robert Jenrick's inflammatory comments about Handsworth sparking accusations of divisive nationalism. We looked at the £8.2 billion auto loan scandal that's finally forcing banks to compensate millions of drivers for years of deception. We discussed David Norris and his refusal to name accomplices in the Stephen Lawrence case, prolonging a family's pain. And we ended with a 7'2" Conservative making headlines just for being exceptionally tall. That's Britain in a nutshell. Espionage scandals the government won't prosecute, politicians saying things that divide communities, corporations finally paying for ripping people off, justice that remains incomplete, and tabloids finding humor wherever they can. It's a country full of contradictions, and that's exactly why it's so fascinating to cover. So here's what I need from you. If you found this valuable, if you appreciate someone breaking down these stories without the corporate filter, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss an update. And if you really want to support what I'm doing here, if you believe independent voices matter in a world where media is controlled by fewer and fewer hands, think about becoming a channel sponsor. It's people like you who make this possible. It's your support that keeps me independent and keeps this channel alive. The news doesn't stop, and neither do I. I'll be back with more coverage, more analysis, and more of the truth the mainstream won't tell you. This is Andrew Meet Rich, and I'll see you in the next one.